points? Yeah, I think we've covered them quite well, Chair, there.
Thank you. Richard Fuller, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome everyone. All of you are directly or involved in the green transition, or obviously very knowledgeable about it. But for many people, it looks like the proposals mean that they're going to have to pay extra for something that they've already got, that their tax bills are going to go up, and that those taxes are going to be spent supporting and subsidizing industries that may or may not make a return. And it looks like a classic big government response, and people are skeptical. So what's your reassurance to them that that's not what's going to happen?
I'll try and answer that, just to give you my opinion from the installer community perspective. I think what we're going to see over the next 3 or 4 years is what we would class as the corporate installer. So major brands like Octopus, who are in the headlines recently with their training development in Slough, but also British Gas coming into this market. And I think that will provide the reassurance to a certain demographic of consumer who will recognise that brand and see that they're offering not only tariff alternatives, but also actually the technology that's available coming to market. I think also knowing that your installation is backed by an MCS standard that's been developed over the last 15 years by industry for industry gives some reassurance that it's actually to a specific standard that's evolved over time, and linked to that the customer protections that it can afford if things do go wrong. But things go wrong with heating systems, whether they're based on a heat pump or whether they're from gas. And we heard recently about a third of gas installations, a recent report said that there were problems with them. So in terms of their installation. So I think consumer education is going to be important, but also that for the next generation of heat pump adopter that aren't innovators, they're the early majority. They are going to be looking for sort of reassurance. They're pragmatists. They want to be convinced that the money is going to be well spent. And so maintenance is important, after sales is important, and choice in terms of an increasing range of suppliers of heat pumps is going to be important.
Thank you for that, Mr. Ray. I want to come to some consumer protection issues with Ms. Gajaro from Citizens Advice in a minute. But just on the point, just so I'm clear, we are asking people to replace a gas boiler with a heat pump. And that does exactly the same thing as their gas boiler does now.
Well, but it does more, doesn't it? It decarbonises their heat, and it makes a contribution to the fight against climate change.
Okay, so that's the benefit. Let's maybe just talk a little bit about taxes to achieve this. As part of decarbonising homes, is it the case that taxes will have to go up? Would anyone like to answer that question? Okay, I guess we'll have to pass that. No one has an idea whether taxes will or will not go up. Let's just ask the question then, is it part of this strategy that the government will subsidise industries?
I'll attempt an answer at that.
You're a courageous man, Mr. Rippon, and I applaud it. And I really can't understand, Chairman, why a simple question about whether what speakers have just been talking about the strategy, things they want to see, they're not prepared to voice an opinion on whether taxes will go up or whether there'll be subsidies for industry. So yes, please go ahead, Mr. Rippon.
I mean, I think there will need to be subsidies for an industry that's in a growth phase, and that's what we're seeing with heat deployment in the UK. Mass adoption of heat pump is the norm on the continent, so we are going to have to fuel that growth, no pun intended. The boiler upgrade scheme makes an attempt at that. Domestic RHI made an attempt at that, but I think we're going. So to answer your question plainly, yes, there's going to need to be more government incentive to get us on the right track. I think then the hope is, and clearly in the heat and building strategy, my reading of this is that post-boiler upgrade scheme and other incentives, there's an expectation that the market will grow to a point where the costs go down, so that, I mean, people like Octopus have already said that their aim is to make a heat pump heating system the same or comparable cost to that of a gas-fired boiler system. So, I mean, we don't buy heating systems for ourselves every week, do we? It's now and then, and when you buy a new home or when it goes wrong, unfortunately, you need to make an investment. So at that point, that moment of truth is there an alternative that allows you to make your contribution to the fight against climate change? And right now, the government needs to make that more affordable because we haven't got scale yet here in the UK.
And the other interesting thing, Mr. Rippon, isn't it, and maybe you'd like to comment on this, is the opportunity for export markets, which that's where the economic opportunity is, isn't it? It's not the replacement of one thing for here within the UK or the skills change, actually, because that's just shifting people from one trade and skill to another. But the export opportunity, did you feel as I did that perhaps the government, the report sort of trailed off a little bit on where that opportunity was, and what would be your judgment, Mr. Rippon, on the export potential? Were they right to sort of say it's there, but we're not sure where it's there at yet, or should they have been bolder?
Them to be bolder, but I yeah, like you, I think that's light on detail. I don't quite understand that from the community that I represent, which are MCS installers, predominantly they're SMEs. I think they've got a great opportunity going forward in terms of the integrated home, time of use tariffs, electrification of heat lends itself to, other electrical appliances, EV charging and time of use tariffs, and when do you heat your hot water through the night, maybe acts as a heat store. And I think that blending these technologies together will become the norm. So I think your heat pump installer is going to become more than that over the next 5 years. So I think that's where the opportunity is.
Thank you. I will come back to Ms. Phillips and Ms. Shepherd in a while, but I did promise to come back to Ms. Gajaro. And I was interested in a comment that you made right at the start in response to the Chair's question about the need for more consumer protections. Could you just, and I think Mr. Rippon spent a bit about that, could you just say what sort of consumer protections you particularly have in mind?
Yes, so when it comes to low carbon heat technologies, we have a couple of consumer codes that make sure that in the process of an installer contacting and engaging with the consumer, they are being upfront about the costs, there's clear contract terms, and that they are providing a good level of aftercare. So if something goes wrong, a consumer can contact them to come back and do the work. But if they don't do that, there is a backstop, there is a redress, and that can be done through the consumer codes, the Renewable Energy Consumer Code and MCS. So they can intervene on a consumer's behalf if there's any problems with their installer. If for any reason that doesn't get resolved, then there is a backstop of an alternate dispute resolution service. It just means that consumers have that protection should something goes wrong, but right up front they're given all the right advice, information, everything is really clear to them so that they can make an informed decision about which technology they want installing in their home. Let's say it's a heat pump in these circumstances. The problem is that across the UK, unless someone is having an installation through one of the government funded programs, there's no obligation on an installer to be a member of that consumer code or MCS accredited. And I should say that if you're MCS accredited, built into that is that you have to be a member of a consumer code. So it's nice and cyclical. It deals with consumer service standards as well as the technical standards of the kit that is going in. So therefore consumers come to us when they literally have nowhere else to go because they have space. We believe it should be made mandatory for all installations in the same way that you wouldn't expect to put a gas boiler in without having a gas safe engineer. We believe there needs to be one single brand or single point of contact that's really clear that consumers recognise and value, and therefore would help them to not fall prey to, as I've already mentioned, we see lots of scammers in this space, especially when grant funding is tailing off. Yeah.
And of course, when you're dealing with something new, the opportunity for scammers is greater because people just don't, you can't talk to your neighbour, can't talk to your friends, and just if I could quote, there's a commitment the government have made in the paper. It says, quote, to ensure that all consumers are made aware of the actions they should be taking, the specific changes that will affect them, and the support available. Do you think that commitment in terms of messaging from the government is sufficient? Or if not, what else would you like to see, Ms. Gujral?
I mean, it's fantastic to see that commitment in writing, but what we actually need to see is that actioned. So there is no national communication strategy around net zero and why it's important, and therefore then what people need to do to help play their part to achieve it. You know, it kind of goes back to your question earlier, and you know, we're seeing real volatility, aren't we, in the gas market, and having a gas boiler all of a sudden is less attractive, and that volatility will only increase as time goes on. So I think the time is right for some real clear messaging around the direction of travel for the energy sector as a whole. And I think if you have that overarching message, and then underneath that people can see, well, how does that affect me? What is it I need to do? And you can see a place where constituencies can start thinking about how they target their messaging for their local communities and their local citizens on what they need. I think that's just the biggest gap overall.
And final question for me to you, Ms. Gujral, is Ms. Phillips earlier on had some very creative ideas about how to protect people on low incomes from the transition to net zero. What about the extent of that scale? Do you think that there should be, for those who are perhaps on lowest incomes, there should be complete exemption from any of the costs of transition? What's the view of the Citizens Advice Bureau about how that burden is shared?
Yeah, I mean, it's something we are really concerned about. We're very clear that the transition to net zero needs to be just and fair, and those who are on the lowest incomes need protecting. And I think there are a variety of ways that you can do that, but I think we do need much more clarity on what those mechanisms would be and how that would then impact the overall picture. So because there will be a cost, and that has to be picked up, doesn't it, somewhere? And majoritively, that cost will be picked up by consumers. So how do we protect those people less able to pay, but also not squeeze everyone else too much? Because we know it's a really difficult time overall at the moment.
Thank you, Mr. Garner. Chairman, I'm aware of timing, but I didn't know if Ms. Phillips wanted to come back very briefly on that or some earlier point. Ms. Phillips.
Yeah, Zoe's actually said a lot of the points which I was going to raise, but just to a previous point regarding taxes going up, I don't have a crystal ball, so I'm not able to kind of offer insights on that. But what I will say is that we have seen lots of fear-mongering and confusion around the role of individuals in the clean heat transition. But I think what we can make clear is this isn't going to happen overnight. There's not going to be a boiler police. No one's going to have their boiler ripped out. The Prime Minister, when launching the heat and building strategy, set out an article in The Sun saying that we're going to make sure that the transition is affordable, attractive and common sense. And I think this is what we should be aiming for, and this is the narrative we should be normalising. And like Zoe was saying, there needs much more awareness raising. You know, these are established technologies which are seen in multiple European countries, which are much colder than our own. They do work. We do need to have protections in place. But done well, it is going to be a real benefit for people and common sense as well. And kind of picked up already, but there's a really positive story to tell around green jobs in the UK, but also moving away from imported fossil gas and onto UK renewables and export opportunities as well. And I think, as Ian said, this is absolutely essential for net zero. We're not going to be able to get on track for our climate targets without addressing the sector. So it definitely is knotty, but it's a challenge we've really got to seize hands on.
Thank you very much, Ms. Phillips. Chairman.
Thank you. Just two final questions for me before we wrap up.